Hey folks, I'm William, this is Runeforged, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Twisted Tales issue number 5 by Daniel James over at Burning Light Press. I did want to mention that while this is not a sponsored video, Daniel was kind enough to send me over a free copy of this zine, which of course I do very much appreciate. Okay, so what is Twisted Tales issue 5? Well, it's a 35-page zine featuring a low-level sandbox for the Shadowdark RPG. The setting features a handful of small human settlements bordering a centralized dark forest area. And that forest is largely inhabited by several different factions of bandits, foul gizzards, which are basically an evil race of lizardmen who kidnap nearby villagers and sacrifice them in dark rituals, sinister dread spiders and their prolific matriarchs, who are breeding so quickly that they're actually threatening to overwhelm the entire forest through sheer weight of numbers. Also, there are the vicious undead vites, which are kind of a zombie white hybrid, which I think is very interesting. And at the heart of it all is a mysterious and possibly quite mad sorcerer by the name of Skozla. Some say that he's a devil in the guise of a man. Others say he's a powerful druid seeking revenge on those who take too much from the forest. And others say he's the dark god of the lizard folk made flesh as a result of their grim sacrifices. And I don't know about you, but that sounds very exciting to me personally. But before we go ahead and do our deeper dive, if you are enjoying this video so far, please consider aiding me in my eternal struggle against the dreaded YouTube algorithm by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more exciting Shadowdark content like this in the future. Also, if you're interested in picking up a copy of Twisted Tales issue number 5 for yourself, there is an affiliate link to do so down in the video description, and any purchases made after you click on that link do help to support the channel at no additional cost to you, and I just want to let you know that I do very much appreciate that support. But without further ado, let's get back into Twisted Tales issue number 5. All right, so I've got the PDF for the zine pulled up here for us to take a look at. Starting off, we've got the cover art. This is very much in keeping with the rest of the series, at least what I've seen so far. I don't dislike this art, but I do think that I would prefer a piece of art that is more kind of maybe closely tied into the overall adventure. Maybe an image of the primary antagonist on the front cover. There's a pretty nice piece of art in here for that individual, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And I wonder if that may have been a better fit for this cover. But again, overall, not a huge issue. Next, we've got our table of contents. You can see this zine is, I think it's about 35 pages long. As I like to see in these types of documents, when it's not in presentation mode, these are hyperlinked, so you can jump directly to the section that you are most interested in, which I think is a really great feature. And all PDF versions of these types of adventure/settings should have hyperlinks in them, if at all possible. Also, you can see a little bit of a breakdown here of what's exactly included in the zine. So we've got the sandbox region of Corvale with 22 cursed locations. We've got 9 new monsters, as well as scores of encounters and treasure tables, which we're going to look at in just a minute. Also, it says a horde of NPCs here and quest prompts to get your party going in this setting. As we've seen in previous Twisted Tales zines, does a pretty good job of breaking down the most crucial information here on this singular page of information, which I think is a good length for an introduction. I will say I wish the introduction went into a little bit more detail on the specific types of creatures that you'll be coming up against in the setting. It does mention here the great spiders as well as the bandits, but there's also the gizzards, which are a race of lizard folk, which play a very prominent role in this adventure, as well as a couple other like kind of lesser type of monsters that I can't remember off the top of my head that might have been a good inclusion here in this introductory section. Down here at the bottom of the page, we've got a D6 table for the various different weather that the characters might encounter as they're adventuring through the setting. Weather is not something that I use a whole lot in my own campaigns, but I think if there were a table like this presented in more adventures, it might be more top of mind. So I actually really do like its inclusion here in this zine. Next, we've got a GM facing version of the map for this region here on the left hand side of the page. I do appreciate that this does use a standard 6-mile hex, because that's what the core Shadowdark rules use as its kind of base assumption, so you don't have to do any sort of conversion when it comes to utilizing the hex crawling rules from the core Shadowdark rules, which I very much appreciate. Another thing that was done in issue number 4 that I was a really big fan of is that the maps were presented in the book kind of vertically facing. So you didn't have to kind of like crane your head to see the details of the map. And I think I would have preferred that at least this GM version of the map that's included here directly in the book actually be vertically aligned. So these numbers would, maybe be facing up and down as opposed to left and right. But again, a very minor quibble. Next, we've got a couple pages of random encounters for the various different region types available in the setting. So we've got kind of the forest edges, which I assume is kind of like the non-forested areas kind of around the edge of the map. We've also got some encounters for the inner forest, which obviously is going to include this heavily forested areas here, kind of in the central area of the setting. And then also some encounters available for the riverways, because there are several different kind of rivers that kind of flow through the setting as well. So that's probably a good way to add a little bit of variety to the otherwise more land kind of creatures that you'll be encountering, kind of in the plains and in the forest. Next, we've got some additional random encounters that might occur in some of the various different towns or settled regions of the map, as well as encounters that might happen along the various different roads that usually connect those settlements. So again, I think this is a really good mix of random encounters. And overall, I'm pretty happy with the variety that's included in these tables. I also like that there are some random events and quests that are tagged to specific settlements within the overall setting. So we've got one for Mullard here, which is kind of like the capital of this region, as well as the settlements of Pendle, Iron Vale, and River Run. Next, we've got some more general information about the setting overall. So the setting being named Corvale, as well as the different settlements that show up in this setting. Some information about the wardens, which, as far as I can tell, is kind of like some sort of militia guard that is responsible for safeguarding this particular region of the world, as well as some additional information about the Corvale forest itself. And the section goes into a little bit more detail about the specific types of creatures that the players might expect to encounter while they're in and around the forest. So it talks about the gizzard clans, the webbed layers of the dread spiders, and of course the unholy remains of the wights, which, as we talked about earlier, are kind of like a zombie wight hybrid, which I think is very cool. Next, we've got some information on some of the local NPCs, as well as some really nice art, which is a step up from the previous scene, which actually had very little art included. So here you can see we've got Lady Esther. She's kind of like the leader of the local area, and she takes up residence in the would-be capital of Mullard. There's also some information here saying how she's childless, and many of the other kind of locals are kind of cozying up to her in hopes that they might become her heir after she passes on. So it might be a good opportunity to add a little bit of political intrigue to your campaign if that's something that you're interested in exploring. Next here we've got Warden Guinevere, who, as far as I can tell, is kind of the leader of the wardens in this area. So again, like the local watch. And again, I think some really cool art here. This is almost kind of giving me kind of like Joan of Arc vibes, also with a reference to Guinevere of Arthurian legends. So always a fan of reusing or slightly modifying names from existing legendariums and kind of seeding those throughout the world. Always appreciate that. And then we've got some other various NPCs here that might serve as either allies or enemies to the parties as they're adventuring in the setting. One of them that was of particular interest to me was Errol the Club, who is essentially, it says he's an immensely muscular man covered in countless scars. And essentially he is one of the various different bandit leaders here in the setting. And he and his gang of bandits have taken up residence in the previously abandoned village of Grimhollow, which, as far as I can tell, is very much a wretched hive of scum and villainy.
You will never find the more wretched hive of scum and villainy
kind of vibe. It might be a really interesting location for the characters to stumble upon throughout the course of their adventures. And there are a few other NPCs here, which of various different levels of importance. So feel free to pause if you want to read through some of these various entries. So at this point, I think we are kind of getting into spoiler territory. If you think you're going to be a player in the setting, now may be a good time to turn off the video and perhaps send it to your GM. All right, so the next couple of pages here kind of go into a little bit more detail about the various different, the horrors of Corvale, which is essentially the various different antagonists that the players might come up against as they're kind of exploring this forested region of the world. And first and foremost among those antagonists is going to be the sorcerer known as Skozla. At one point, it does seem like he was a real boon to this area of the world, well loved and respected throughout the land. But at some point, something bad happened to our good friend Skozla, and it seemed like he might have gone just a little bit mad. And now he's kind of the source, or at least a stirrer of the pot, for all of the various different antagonistic forces that are existing within the forest, or at least most of them. And one thing that this zine does that I think is really interesting it doesn't really give you a firm idea of exactly who Skozla is, but it instead offers you a few different possible alternatives. So one of the rumors is that Skozla is a devil trapped in the forest, only able to leave after collecting enough souls. Another says that he is a powerful druid seeking revenge on those who take from the forest. Others say that he is a god brought about by the gizzards and will only disappear when they are destroyed. So again, just giving the GM a little bit of choice in terms of how they would like to portray this character in their game. Now, while I do think this is an interesting approach, I will give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. There is not a defined stat block for Skozla in this adventure. Instead, it gives some various different options for creatures that you could use from the core Shadowdark rulebook in order to represent Skozla in your game. I think that my preference would be that the author, give us a fleshed out version of what their vision of this character is supposed to be, hopefully with its own custom stat block. And if it turns out that I'm not a big fan of whatever the stat block is or whatever the direction is, as a GM, I'm perfectly able to change that stuff on my own. But I would love to see what the author's original intention was for this character. And if I like it, I can just use that without having to do a bunch of extra work behind the scenes. Again, overall, not a huge complaint, but that would be my own personal preference. Next, we've got some more detailed information about the various different factions of creatures that serve as antagonists in the setting. So we've got some additional information on the Gizzard clans, the Dread Spider Dens, as well as the Curse of the Vites, which, as I mentioned earlier, are these kind of zombie white hybrids that are kind of threatening a zombie-like outbreak in the region, which I think is very cool and would love to see play out at the table. Next, we've got about half a page of information for the 22 different points of interest included in the campaign setting. And I actually really appreciate that this kind of first place of interest here, I think, is actually a really good starting location. So if you are going to throw your players in the setting, I think that this very first point of interest, this Red Wheel Tavern, is a great place to start them off. And that will lead them very naturally into the settlement of Mullard, which is kind of like the capital of this particular area of the world. And something that I really appreciate about Mullard is if we come down to this next page here, we can see various different lists of quests that are available from the townsfolk of Mullard. And I think this section actually does a really great job of gently informing and directing the players to deal with some of the various different threats in the forest, without being overtly heavy-handed and kind of forcing them to go and take on these tasks in a particular order. So obviously the main quest of this region is to kill the sorcerer known as Skozla, who they frame as a corrupt wizard who can be found deep within the forest. It also talks about several different bandit factions that are at work within the forest. So it's got the crew led by Black Tongue Jezebel, a separate crew led by the twins, and of course the infamous Errol the Club, who has taken up residence in the previously abandoned town of Grimhollow and is kind of running this seedy town that I think the players would have a lot of fun exploring. It also goes on to inform a little bit about the Gizzard threat in the form of the Gizzard King, and also puts a little bit of a bounty on each Gizzard tail that the players are able to return to the town of Mullard or to the Wardens overall. Also talks a little bit about the Vite incursion, especially the area of the Vite graveyard, which I believe is maybe the original source, or like the original source in this area of the Vite curse. And then some additional other points of interest kind of in the setting that the players might want to go and clear out in order to rid the land of some of the various antagonistic forces that are plaguing it. And I'm not going to go through each of these individual points of interest one by one. As I'm scrolling through, definitely feel free to pause and read through whichever ones strike your fancy. But I will say that I do really appreciate the inclusion of some of these D4 tables for some of the various different points of interest. They just go on to give a little bit more, randomized or semi-randomized flavor to those different points of interest. So here we've got the bandit camp, which is, obviously infested with bandits. And the additional information that it gives down here is a D4 table of various different bandit ambush tactics. So you can add a little bit of variety to the some flavor to the various different ambushes the bandits might do to either the players or various different NPC passersby, which I think it's a nice little bit of customization and variety that you don't always see in supplements like this. And I really do appreciate that overall. All right, so again, just kind of scrolling through here pretty quickly. Another area of interest that I liked here was the Dread Lair. This is one of the spider dens throughout the map. And it is, of course, one of the main creatures here is going to be the the lesser dread spiders, which are kind of like all over the forest. But then in these various different dens, there's also going to be a dread matriarch, which is like a level 5 boss adjacent monster spider, who is responsible for churning out all the various different spiderlings in this region. And of course, being able to deal with the matriarch should, reduce the overall number of spiders in the region, over time. I think these kind of like half pages of information are exactly the right length in terms of the amount of information that I would want to run this point of interest effectively. I know that kind of the Curse Scroll zines for Shadowdark, a lot of those points of interest are a lot shorter. And in some cases, I found those to be a little bit too light on information. And I felt like I was having to do too much of the heavy lifting when it came to trying to flesh out those various different regions. And again, I just think this kind of half page of information per point of interest is kind of a sweet spot, at least for me personally. Another location I thought was really interesting is number 12 here, the Oasis Glade. And this is just kind of like a safe spot in the middle of the forest that the players might be able to use to rest and recoup as they travel through the otherwise very dangerous forested area of this setting. And I don't remember if it says it in here in this particular text, but there were vague allusions to a previous figure who, like Saint Willow of Gede. And I don't know if it expressly makes this connection, but I kind of like to think that this area was maybe tied to that individual in some way. And that's kind of the reason that this is a relatively safe spot within the forest. And if that's the case, I think that's a cool little bit of world building and a little bit of connecting the dots to make an even cooler area than is what otherwise is kind of mentioned in the text here. Next, we come to arguably one of the most important points of interest in the entire setting, which is going to be Skosla's Tower. And unlike some of the other sections, which are mostly like, half a page in length, we do actually get a full page going over Skosla's Tower. Quite a bit of it is taken up by this very nice piece of art we've got here. Looks like kind of a wizard's tower that's been overgrown by vines and, maybe webs. Again, just gives a little bit of information about this location, as well as some various different options that GMs might be able to use to represent Skosla in the game. So it says that, Skosla can be as weak as or as powerful as desired. You can either be a devil-like immortal spirit, a druid with stats on page 213 of the Shadowdark rulebook, a mage, or even a lich. And it also gives some information here about what happens upon Skosla's death. It says the gizzards will halt their sacrifices, the dread spiders will become less ferocious and hide their presence from people, and encounters will occur half as often. And I actually really like this. It gives kind of like a soft climax to the overall campaign, and it also goes a long way towards helping the characters feel like their actions actually kind of have an impact on the overall world. And of course, you can always do this as the GM. You can make judgment calls about, how certain things or certain actions will affect your world overall. But I think it's actually really nice to have it explicitly called out here in this section of the setting. Next, we've got a little bit of information about a point of interest called Grim Hollow, which we talked a little bit about earlier. And this is the home of Errol the Club, who's kind of like the bandit king or bandit lord of this area. And I'm actually really interested and excited about this area because it's not coded directly as like this will 100% be just a combat encounter with the characters coming in and directly assaulting this bandit camp. It is very much kind of set up like a neutral / chaotic settlement where ne'er-do-wells and rogues, etc., gather to do some of their shady or less savory business. And I just think that's a really cool. It's almost kind of like a pirate town to some extent. So I just think that this particular location has a lot of promise in terms of the various different interactions and encounters that you might be able to have in the location. And I'd just be really curious to see how my players go about kind of interacting with the space and how they choose to deal with Errol the Bandit Lord. Yeah, overall, very cool and very interesting location. Next, we've got this Hilltop Tavern, which very much seems like a kind of fortified rest location. Kind of similar in my mind to like the Friendly Arm Inn from Baldur's Gate 1, if any of you guys are familiar with that. And this also happens to be the current location of Warden Guinevere, who, as far as I understand, is kind of like the leader of the wardens or the local guard in this area. And I just think she's kind of a cool character. It says, so she's here right now. It says she is currently resting from injuries after single-handedly taking on a gang belonging to the twins, which are, another set of bandit lords kind of in this area. And I just think that's kind of cool flavor and a cool way to introduce this character to the PCs. And again, another random table to give a little bit more flavor to this location. This one specifically being tavern events. So one of them is a drinking, card, and arm wrestling tournament, which is about to begin. Very cool. 2 wardens arrive injured from a recent ambush on the road, which could set up as some sort of quest or plot hook. The next one says a merchant caravan arrives with exotic wares. So definitely like an opportunity for the characters to pick up some interesting items, maybe even some magical potions. And the last one here is that the bandits attempt to infiltrate the tavern, which obviously is a very cool setup as well. All right, continuing on. All right, here on the left, we finish up the last of the points of interest, and we kind of move into more of the appendix section, starting with the treasure. And I actually really like this. It splits the treasure down into common loot, which is, D20 table, which again just kind of contributes to this overall vibe with the random tables of creating a little bit of variety in the various different things that you might encounter in the setting. And next, a D10 table for arcane relics, which are typically going to be the more powerful magical items that you're going to run into in the course of your adventures. And overall, I just really like these tables. It adds a little bit of randomness, it adds a little bit of variety, and just all of these things, or at least most of the items, seem to be tied directly into the setting in some way. Which is something that I very much appreciate over the more like gonzo out there random items that you might expect to pick up in, a more typical kind of old school scenario. Next, we move kind of into the creature section of the book. We've got some information here on cricksaurs, which are giant cricket-like beasts that feed on small livestock. When frenzied, their chirp can cause deafness. I was not expecting to run into any cricket-like monsters in this setting, so I think that's kind of new and interesting. We've also got some stats here for a gulperfish, which I assume you're going to find in some of the river locations in the setting. And of course, we've been talking about the vites. Again, zombie white hybrids. And we've even got a little bit of art here for the Vite, which again, I very much appreciate, especially considering how light issue number 4 was on art overall. We've got a page here dedicated to the gizzards. And I really appreciate that we're getting multiple different types of gizzards as opposed to just like, oh, here's your basic gizzard and we're not going to give you any additional information. So we've got a gizzard brute, which is, I guess, kind of like their more elite, kind of beefy ones. Even though this is not what I traditionally think of as kind of a lizard folk, I do kind of like this art. And I especially like this kind of weird like skull headpiece it's got on. I think that's really cool. Also give us some stats for a gizzard hexer. Not a gizzard wizard, that rhymes. I might have gone with gizzard wizard just solely on the rhyme scheme alone, but gizzard hexer, and gives us a spellcasting variant here which has vine snare, which paralyzes an opponent, and also a slow hex, which reduces the target's dexterity to 1 for 1d4 rounds. So again, a nice little bit of variety. You're not just throwing basic gizzards at your players for the entirety of the set, which I very much appreciate. Next, we've got a page here dedicated to the dread spiders. Looks like we've got your basic dread spider. We've got your dread spider spitter, which is a more elite version here. You can see level 3 as opposed to level 1. There's also some spiderlings here, which you can use the spider stat block on page 254 of the Shadowdark core rulebook. And then finally, of course, we have the dread matriarch, which is a very nasty level 5 threat, which should be pretty beefy and pretty scary in the context of a low-level campaign. And of course, that scariness built directly into the stat block here in the form of Terrify, which looks like it's going to cause a DC 13 charisma check or give disadvantage on all attacks for 1d4 rounds. And I will say that I really do like this implementation of kind of a fear mechanic. I don't necessarily love mechanics that dictate that characters have to run away. I think that's taking a little bit too much agency away from the character. I like this implementation where, they're still able to act, albeit at a disadvantage, but they still have control of their character, and there's still maybe some interesting decisions to be made about whether or not they do want to try to attack with disadvantage, or whether or not they want to use that action for, some sort of non-combat ability. So yeah, again, overall, a big fan of this implementation of the fear mechanic. All right, and that brings us to the end of the book. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the additional standalone files that were included with the setting. All right, so in addition to the actual PDF itself, we do get some additional maps. As you can see here, we do have a full color version of the region map for this area. This does look like a player-facing version of the map because I don't see any labels on here in terms of the various different points of interest. We've also got a player-facing black and white version of the map. And then finally, we have this black and white. It looks like a GM-facing version of the map, but kind of curiously, the points of interest are not labeled on here, which I think is kind of a curious choice. I guess you could maybe use this as a player-facing map, and they know that there's something interesting at that location, but they just don't know exactly what it is. I guess that's one approach. I think I would have preferred, it's fine that this version of the map exists, but I would also like to see a version of this map that has the, it has at least the numbers written into the hexes here, so that we could refer back to the appropriate section in the book. Or even, I wouldn't be upset if there was like the name of the actual point of interest printed directly on the map as well. But yeah, overall, I don't think I can complain too much, because I do appreciate the fact that there are both player and GM facing versions of the map, with the main GM facing version being in the book itself. But I love that both of those options are available, as well as a color version as well, which I think is kind of above and beyond. Next, we've also got some tokens here for the various different relevant NPCs and characters, which is pulled directly from the artwork in the book. I think there's a little bit of a display glitch on my end here, showing this as being kind of colored in black around the dread spider here. But if we go into the actual token itself, you can see, it looks just fine from this view. So we've got the dread spider here. We've got that gizzard, which we saw earlier, which is a very cool piece of art. We've got Lady Esther, who again is kind of the leader of this human element of this part of the world, excluding the bandits. Then we've got Skozla himself, which is kind of like this mad sorcerer character. Very cool. I actually like this bit of art quite a bit. Next, we've got the token for the Vites, which are going to come up quite often in the adventure, I would imagine. As well as for Warden Guinevere, who again is the leader of the Warden faction in the setting, which are kind of like the local guardsmen. But yeah, so those are the extras that are included along with the PDF. Okay, so what are my overall thoughts on Twisted Tales issue number 5? Well, while I didn't like it quite as much as I did issue 4, I still think this is a very solid zine for an absolutely phenomenal price. I think that $3 US is an absolute steal for these zines. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the things that I liked about this issue. Okay, so just like volume 4, this issue has an exceptionally clean layout, and it's very easily readable, which is something that I value quite a bit. It also has this very solid dark fantasy human-centric setting, which is something that I very much prefer. And I think that there are quite a few interesting and very well-connected locations, NPCs, creatures, and treasures. I also really like the way that the missions and bounties were set up, kind of in that opening settlement in the setting. As I mentioned earlier, I think this did a really good job of gently informing and directing the players of the various different threats in the region, without railroading them into, tackling them in a specific order, or even tackling them at all if they are not that interested in those particular threads. So overall, just a very solid kind of player-facing intro to the dangers that they might expect to face in this setting. Also, issue number 5 goes a long way towards mitigating probably the primary criticism that I had of issue number 4, which was an overall abundance of white space and a lack of art, which admittedly is very much kind of a nitpick and very understandable given the affordability of these zines. I also really appreciate the fact that there were both GM and player facing versions of the region maps for this area. And I also think that including a color version of the map is also very cool. I also really appreciated that they included tokens for, the more relevant NPCs and creatures that you might expect to find in the setting. And I really do think that is kind of above and beyond, although kind of secretly, I wish this would become, common practice for these types of zines. And indeed, kind of any Shadowdark supplement that includes creatures in them. Okay, so what are the things that I didn't like as much? So I have to say that the setting, at least kind of at the outset, did not grab me in the same way that issue number 4's setting did. And it does feel a little bit kind of just more generic, which personally I'm fine with. But I definitely know that there are plenty of people out there where if you tell them that something is kind of generic, they will immediately turn off, and it's like the biggest sin that you could possibly create in terms of adventure or setting design. Again, I am not one of those people. And I actually think that the setting grew on me quite a bit as I was reading through the zine, even though it didn't capture me immediately in the introduction in the same way that issue number 4 did. Also, I find it really odd when supplements don't tell you kind of right at the beginning what level is appropriate for this setting. Based on powers of deduction and most of the monsters being between level 1 and level 3, with some being level 5. I think we can safely assume that this is a relatively low level sandbox setting, and that was also confirmed by the author when I reached out to him. But I do think it would be nice to have just a very quick blurb both on the drive-through RPG page and kind of in the introduction section of the zine, if not on the front cover itself. Just a very quick and easy way for GMs to know exactly what they're going to be getting themselves into in terms of the level of the adventure. And I think also, like, if you had a suggested player count, I also see people ask about that in the comments on a fairly regular basis. So including number of players and suggested level would probably go a long way towards mitigating some of those questions and make it more likely that people are going to pick up your product. And finally, I think maybe my biggest issue with the zine, which is still relatively minor overall, is that I really wish that we would have gotten a more fleshed out version of Skozla, who's kind of, in my opinion, supposed to be kind of the main antagonist of this setting, and also meant to serve as kind of the climax for this overall part of the campaign. I don't dislike the approach where the author gives multiple different suggestions for what this creature might be in terms of both the story and stat blocks available in the core Shadowdark rules that might represent this character. But again, I really would have liked to see a custom stat block for him that would hopefully go a long way towards creating a unique and memorable encounter for this character. If you want to include other options for GMs to use if they're not like thrilled with that core concept, I think that's fine as well. But yeah, overall, despite those relatively minor issues, I think this is a very solid zine, and I'm very much looking forward to issue number 6 when it comes out. Again, if you'd like to pick up a copy of this zine for yourself, there is an affiliate link down in the video description. Also, please consider checking out my video review of Twisted Tales issue 4, which should be popping up on your screen right about now. And I'll also include a link to that video down in the video description. Finally, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Twisted Tales issue 5, as well as your suggestions for what Shadowdark content I should be looking at in the future. But I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye.